Aloha! Michelle Hernandez here, and welcome to Life is Constant Hawaii TV. This channel is about bringing you hope, joy, and love. We are continuing our series on Can We Trust the Bible? And today we're specifically going to go into how archaeology and science meet the Bible. And specifically, we're going to be talking about the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. So stick with me and let's check it out together. Alright, well, we're continuing the series about Can We Trust the Bible and its credibility. So it's very challenging for me, as I've already said. There are several other episodes, so check those out also. But I'm really excited to present the material today about the Dead Sea Scrolls and what I found out about that. Also, just reviewing some things. I have gone deep. There's two guys that I have really focused in on. I mean, there's so many resources out there about the history of the Bible, but I mean, Dr. Michael Heiser is a biblical scholar that I would say please check him out if you do not know his name and his books. Read several of his books. Last name is spelled Heiser. And then also Eric Metaxas, spelled Metaxas. He just launched a book called Is Atheism Dead? And I'm part of his launch club, and I'm getting through that book as quickly as possible. Brilliant writer. And he also has a website, so just Google his name and you'll love his material. It's Eric Metaxas again. And so I'm going to be talking about both of some of their thoughts and writings in this episode as well. But it's amazing to me, with the book of, especially Old Testament, there's lots of debate and attacks on the book of God, and lots of theories out there. And Eric Metaxas, when he's writing his book on Is Atheism Dead, really does a good job of summarizing some of the main issues on it. In Eric's book, he says, no archaeological finding has ever contradicted a biblical reference. And that's a quote from a well-known rabbi. And you'll have to check out the book to see who wrote that. But that's amazing, right? Like, when you talk about the science of archaeology, though, too, this one discovery that I found out recently was that it's really not that old of a science. However, since that science has started, we've just had so many gems and wonderful revelations in history discovered and backed by the scientists on these discoveries. So, I mean, they know how to dig into the ground, and as they dig in deeper and deeper and deeper, as they go into the depth of the soil, they can tell what year they're in because of the findings of the pottery and like the technology that was used in like forming bricks and how bricks were made and things like that, right? So hugely interesting. Eric points out in his book that many challenges to the Bible, and a lot of the biggest challenges many times are pointing to the first stories that are in part of the book of Genesis, the first book of the Bible. And he talks about the stories of Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel and Noah's Ark. And these are common known stories that we would learn, in Sunday school, if you've ever gone to Sunday school. And Eric, his would be a quote from his book, just cleverly points out that these stories, like if the standard Bible runs to about 1,235 pages, these earliest stories only make up something like the first 9 pages. Wouldn't that be something? It's something, right? Like that just demonstrates our society in many people's mind when you just stay completely closed-minded and you're like, you just nitpick the Bible and you stop it. Like, you don't even go beyond page 9 of the Bible to say that the entire Bible is just made up fairy tales. Wow. So I thought that was really clever that he pointed that out. And also the other attack that Eric says, and also Michael Heiser says, is that the Old Testament is commonly attacked because they say that because they weren't, the language wasn't developed back then or something, that it would be impossible that it was actually written, and that as it was translated over and over and copied over and over, that the big church, the big church leaders would, manipulate how the translation should be so that it would meet their purposes and their narrative versus how God really wanted it written. So there would be a big argument about that the translations over all these years couldn't possibly be accurate. And so Eric Metaxas does a good job as well as describing writings of Julius Caesar, for example, saying that he had written about his military successes during the first century BC, and the oldest surviving copy of that manuscript was the 18th century AD, which would be 900 years later. And there were other historical writings that Eric's book points out where the oldest copy of those manuscripts would be 1,300 to 1,700 years later. And so he's saying that, even though we're only finding copies, years and years, eons of time later, since the original words were written, the skeptics hugely accept that these writings as truth, where they attack the Bible, and saying that, using the argument that, well, it's not the original. So the hypocrisy of such an attack, and it's just very illogical and unfair to use one standard and just because it's not the Word of God, well, let's accept that as true, but because we just want to stay closed-minded and we're just going to say, well, that can't possibly be true, and just say, well, we've never found the original, so it can't be true. So that is, I thought that was well said from Eric. Going back to Dr. Michael Heiser, he describes how the original Hebrew language develops and how it kind of grows over time. I've previously talked about that in a previous episode. And he also talked about how the religious leaders of the past, the Jewish leaders and the Christian leaders, would argue about what would be acceptable in their Bible or version of the Bible, one that we would, as a Christian, we would call it the Old Testament. And for the most part, the Torah was accepted. Those books were accepted, but then there would be a debate on what other books would be accepted or would not be accepted as to be part of the actual canonized Bible of the Old Testament. And there's different names of it, but remember that the original languages were like Hebrew, Aramaic, and then Greek. And when the Old Testament was translated into Greek, and all the books that were chosen to be part of that, it would be known as the Septuagint version of the Old Testament. That would be that's the Greek. That's the original Greek translated from the original Hebrew Bible into Greek, and would be the well-known Old Testament version during Jesus' days. So there'd be, all that to say that there's several versions of this Old Testament circulating back then and being argued about over time, and it still gets argued about to this day. So all this to build up to the fact of the greatest discovery ever, and that would be the Dead Sea Scrolls in 1947. And then the story, how it would go, is just obviously a God story in my mind. And so how it happens is east of Jerusalem, in an area called Qumran, there was a shepherd boy, and he was taking care of his herds, and he noticed that he was missing a goat. So he went over in this area. Now this area is a bunch of cliffs overlooking the Dead Sea, which the Dead Sea is known to be 1,400 feet below sea level, and marks, interestingly enough, the lowest point on our planet. So, in the early 1947, a 12-year-old boy, shepherd boy, is going to look for his lost goat. He's climbing around in all these cave areas, and he sees this really deep cave, dark cave. He throws a stone down there. It hits a glass jar, and he climbs down there to go find what was broken, and inside there is an actual the first Dead Sea Scroll that would be discovered. It is old manuscript, and it would start to it would be one of our biggest historical finds ever, especially when it's related to the biblical original writings, or copies of the oldest writings and versions of the biblical manuscripts of the Old Testament to be found. So it's like a great thing. Now, thousands and thousands, there's like, I guess 11 caves in total in the area, and thousands of manuscripts were found, or remnants of it. Some were full scrolls, but many more was just remnants of Old Testament scrolls, or even non-biblical writings as well. And some of these remnants were like at the size of the palm of your hands, they say, and then others were the size of a thumbnail. So some were in jars, but much more were like just part of the bottom of these caves, buried in bat stuff, right? So they had to get cleaned up and processed and analyzed. And so it took many years to do that before the information would come out to us from that original discovery date. And they were carbon-14 dated, the process of carbon-14, and also other scientific analysis methods was utilized to date these manuscripts. So before the discovery of these scrolls, the oldest complete copy of the Old Testament in Hebrew was from AD 1008, and more than 1,400 years after the Old Testament was completed. So fragments from the Dead Sea Scrolls now close the gap by 1,000 years, and left the world waiting to see if the text had been transmitted accurately. So it closed the rewriting. So I mean, now instead of the copy being the copy now was 400 years later from the original writing. How they know the original writing, we kind of talked about that previously, but it's a very complicated process. So I mean, so more than 1,400 years after the Old Testament was completed, fragments from the Dead Sea Scrolls now close the gap by 1,000 years, and now left the world waiting for, hey, was the translation accurate? And by the time I got through it all, they actually found 37 of the 39 books of the Old Testament were represented in the Dead Sea discovery. So 37 of the 39 books of the Old Testament were represented, meaning there's remnants found. They were matching up. They were taking the language and matching it up with the versions. Now, Michael Heiser would also talk about and analyze the language of the Hebrew language in all the other versions. Remember that we just talked about that there would be all these versions, and he would say what he thinks is hugely important in the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls is that all three of the textual traditions of the Old Testament were represented. So he explains it like that the Qumran area was preserving manuscripts for the people of the past, like a Christian bookstore would do to us currently, in that the Christian bookstore currently would be providing different English translations of the Bible. And so Michael Heiser says that, stating that it is well accepted in the Jewish culture 2,000 years ago to review all of the translations and the different books that were available to their Bible at the time. So meaning it gives credibility to the the original Hebrew, the Septuagint, and the different versions that were happening. So it was the Jewish people or in this area were just accepting them all as, just like we accept different translations. So that was great news. Like, it was like, stop arguing about that, because if the people at the time it was well accepted, then we certainly shouldn't nitpick about, this isn't inspired by God, or they accepted it. They understood that there were different languages and there was different translations, but still wasn't knocking out the Spirit of the Lord and what the big picture was of it. In fact, as they were, this other article I was reading was talking about the findings, let's see, Dead Sea Scrolls in the Bible. There's a book written by Charles Pfeiffer in 1967. He says the Old Testament books from Qumran are those which we find in our Bibles. Minor textual variants occur as they do in any document which depends on hand copies for multiplication, but the biblical text may be regarded as essentially reliable, which is absolutely wonderful, right? And there was no evidence found. He further says that there was no evidence found from Qumran to justify a major reassessment of the traditional views of the origin of biblical writing. So that's huge. That's huge. It closed the gap by 1,000 years as far as when the original Bible was would be written down to a copy, and it also got rid of the entire notion that the monks got it wrong and was copying it wrong, it was big church in operation. So it gave huge credibility to the Old Testament. Some tried to argue, and I would find in some of my readings, that there would be New Testament manuscripts in there, and I guess that didn't hold water. So I wasn't finding anything there. But I think that it's great that the Old Testament at this point, and that's what our today's episode is about, is the Dead Sea Scroll discovery and how archaeology and it matches and is supporting the Bible, and that the Old Testament is actually a good representation. Now let's bring in some God stuff, because Eric does a really good job of summarizing this. So he's like, just think about everything that has to come together in order for this big giant discovery to be made. So the location of the caves, number one, is far below sea level, and it is in a place of near perfect aridity. So the condition is perfect in the cave. Next, the scrolls were, for unknown reasons, made of sheepskin. Next, the ink that was used on the scrolls happened to be made of soot or lamp black, which is inert and therefore extremely long-lasting. And finally, the caves in which these scrolls were stored provided an environment of remarkably stable temperature and virtually no airflow. So now here is a quote by Eric Metaxas in his book, Is Atheism Dead? In other words, no better environment could be imagined. In fact, once the scrolls were examined, it was nearly impossible even for man-made technology to recreate an environment as perfect as the one in which they were discovered. So amidst these circumstances, in the silent and dark stillness, these scrolls waited through the silent hours and days of 20 centuries. In that time, many empires rose and fell. Halley's Comet came and went 27 times, and then one day in 1947, as if in the fullness of time, a straying goat caused a door to be opened to the past. That's a quote by Eric Metaxas. That's an example of his beautiful writing style. That's why you gotta get his book. But wow, right? Now think of that as far as it's a major, that's totally God. That's just how he does things. That's an example of Eric's writing, and that's just a little tiny bit. His writing is brilliant, and he brings it all together, and he hears the voice of God. He follows and is obedient to God's direction, and, even in the writing and the timing of this book. And so I would highly encourage you to get it. I don't get anything from encouraging you to that, except for that I just think the guy is just wonderful, and he needs to be supported, and he should be supported financially as well. But this is amazing. This is only, it's, even when I heard just a little bit years ago about how a shepherd boy threw a rock and it found, the Dead Sea Scrolls, I'm thinking, that's totally how God works. He knows the exact time when to reveal things of his ways. And so he knew that in this date, that we would need to have some reassurance of the Old Testament, and the Dead Sea Scrolls would be discovered at that time and that place, and then have this wonderful, wonderful story that revolves around it, so that we can put to bed some of the many arguments that they use against the Bible. And so I just think that's beautiful. I think that's beautiful. So thank God for God, right? So anyways, I hope you enjoyed today, and sorry if it got a little complicated, but it's certainly complicated in my head a little bit. I'm just trying to give it justice, because I mean, God is a great God, and He gives us everything that we need when we need it in perfect timing. So if you haven't already, like the channel, subscribe to the notifications, leave me a comment, share the channel, download my book, A Father's Love. It's free, and it's in PDF format in the description below. So until next time, mahalo and aloha.